Welcome to the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. Welcome to ITSP Magazine. You're listening to a new The Hacker Factory podcast with hacker maker Phillip Wylie. You're about to discover what the role of a professional hacker entails, the different specializations it holds, and what it takes to learn and become one. Enjoy the conversation as Phillip and guests unveil the secrets of professional hacking, a mysterious, intriguing, and often misunderstood occupation. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
BugCrowd's award-winning platform combines actionable contextual intelligence with the skill and experience of the world's most elite hackers to help leading organizations identify and fix vulnerabilities, protect customers, and make the digitally connected world a safer place. Learn more at bugcrowd.com.
Hello, I'm Phillip Wylie, the host of the Hacker Factory podcast. Thanks for joining the podcast. I refer to myself as the hacker maker because I'm passionate about educating and mentoring those that are aspiring to be penetration testers, red teamers, or other offensive cybersecurity professionals. And each episode, I have some really cool people from the industry and the community that have some cool stories to tell. But today we're going to get away from more of the storytelling and get into some really cool technical stuff. I have from SpectrOps, Will and Lee on here with some really cool research they've done on Active Directory vulnerabilities. They spoke on this at Black Hat, so we're in for a treat today to get to hear about this technical information. So why don't you guys kick it off by introducing yourselves?
My name is Will Schroeder. My handle is HarmJoy on Twitter, GitHub, and all that fun stuff. I'm a technical architect at SpectrOps, along with my coworker Lee here, who I've worked with for a number of years. Kind of briefly on my background, I started with a computer science degree with a focus in information security, went straight into a master's in InfoSec a number of years ago, worked at two different research labs, SCI, CERT, and then Sandia National Labs doing cybersecurity type work. And I eventually transitioned into the private sector and started doing penetration testing and red teaming with Varus Group in the Adaptive Threat Division. A number of those people, including myself and Lee and a few others, ended up joining SpectrOps a number of years ago, right when it kind of started up. And, I've just been kind of doing capability development and research and Active Directory type stuff for a number of years. So.
Yep. And my name is Lee Christensen. I go by Tifkin on Twitter. And like Will, I'm a technical architect here at SpectrOps. And basically what that means is just, we're responsible for building out new capabilities for our offensive services. So that's tools or doing some like research and development into new attack techniques or figuring out how to do things a different way. So I got introduced kind of into security as a kid, a lot younger. By hacking games. I really liked playing games when I was younger and learned that people were hacking them. So I wanted to figure out how. So learned a little bit of programming and assembly. And that definitely helped as I was, hacking on online games back in the day. From there, I got a degree in computer science, and then got my start doing web app testing and AppSec. Went on to do network testing at Silent Break Security. From there, I later spent a couple years there and then went to Varus Group, where I started working with Will and a lot of the great people over there. And then kind of from Varus Group came over and helped start up SpectrOps as well, and just have been going from there ever since.
Well, those are some really cool backgrounds and some cool companies to work for. And back to Will, the Sandia Labs, I had someone recently, I was helping out in the Career Village at DEF CON, and this one young man, recent college grad, was working for Sandia Labs and got offered a job with Google. And he was mentioning, I said, Sandia Labs, that's going to be good on your resume. Oh, you've heard of them? And I thought, so interesting to hear that after talking to this person at DEF CON. So really interested to hear about the research that you all have been doing with Active Directory. So if you guys want to start discussing that and share that with our listeners, that would be awesome.
Sounds great. So this research that was released a few months ago in the form of a white paper called Certified Pre-Owned, Abusing Active Directory Certificate Services. We also presented on it with the same title at Black Hat. So it all kind of started back in early January, late December, and Lee was reading the Active Directory technical specification, as one often does. And he noticed a bit where just a couple sentences where it's talking about authenticating to LDAP with certificates and these types of things. And it's an area of research that Lee and I had been interested in for a number of years from kind of the smart card perspective, but we never fully understood it. So he started asking some questions. We started going back and forth. And then months later, everything snowballed, and what was a short blog post turned into a 140-page white paper, multiple offensive tools, and a Black Hat presentation. So that's kind of how it all came about. Lee and I have been involved in Active Directory security, offensive and defensive, for a number of years. And just kind of I'll kind of talk about just kind of the background real quickly. I'll start and you kind of riff on it for some of the AD certificate services stuff. But ADCS, we'll use that as abbreviation, so saying Active Directory Certificate Services the entire time. It's a server role that functions as the public key infrastructure, or PKI implementation for Microsoft. So it's used from everything from like code signing certs, and internal SSL, and smart cards, and client authentication, where there's this whole enrollment process where you submit something called a CSR, or a certificate signing request, to a certificate authority for a particular template, which is a set. It's kind of like a blueprint of a bunch of different settings, which we'll get into here in a bit. And if that request is valid, you're able to do it. The certificate authority will sign your request and issue a certificate, which can be used for different things. So the system's pretty complex. There's a lot of moving pieces. For kind of complete details on some stuff, I'll tweet out, or I have, and I will retweet out the link to the Black Hat slides and things like that. I know they're also on the Black Hat website, where we have lots of like graphics and walking through the enrollment and all that kind of stuff. But two main things I'll kind of touch on and pass to Hughley. There's for these templates that kind of define the aspects of a certificate that is issued to you. There's a couple things that are interesting with these templates. One of them is something called enhanced key usage, or an EKU. That's basically a bunch of numbers or IDs that define how the resulting certificate can be used. Like if it's for code signing or SSL, it's just a system that says this is what the resulting cert can be used for. So there's a number of these EKUs that allow the certificate to be used for authentication to Active Directory. And that's what we focused on. There's a lot of parts of the system we didn't touch on, even in the 140-page white paper. We had to draw the line somewhere. And there's the one other thing that's kind of a crux of a lot of these misconfigurations of the situation is this idea of subject alternative names, which is in the concept of certificates. It's a way to have additional subject names that can be used in the same cert. And the original idea for this was, like SSL, you could have one certificate with multiple subject alternative names for other hosts internally. So you didn't have to issue a new cert for every single host. But when this is combined with certificates that allow for domain authentication, if you have a subject alternative name in your certificate as somebody else, you can authenticate as that person. So a lot of these misconfigurations, which is just one aspect of the research they'll touch on, but subject alternative names, if you can coerce an administrator to be in your subject alternative name, and that template resulting certificate can be used for domain authentication, then you're able to authenticate as that elevated user as somebody else. So I think that's kind of the crux of several of the misconfigurations. I'll pass it to Lee to kind of take it from there.
Yeah, I'd say, just to kind of add on to that, Active Directory itself is a big thing that we find oftentimes in environments, and it's responsible for, it's kind of a database that contains all of the users in the network. And so most commonly people are used to logging in on a network using like their username and password. But what we learned, and kind of like, as Will said, what I wasn't aware of when starting this research, is that you could actually log on using a certificate, like he said. So rather than using a password, you can use this special kind of file called a certificate to log on instead. And it's completely separate from your password. And I was completely unaware of that. And so we started diving into these certificates and kind of learning how they worked and how you actually go about receiving them in the first place. And that's where Active Directory Certificate Services comes in. Like without Active Directory Certificate Services, that additional authentication technique, so besides just using a password, it wouldn't be possible. So you need to have ADCS installed in order to be able to use a certificate to actually log on inside of a network. And so while we started learning about this, like one of the first things that you have to do is figure out how to actually obtain a certificate in the first place. So like, how do you actually go about getting these things? And we didn't have any idea how any of this worked prior. We hadn't looked at it at all. So 6 months ago, we were probably on the same level as most people in our industry. Like we didn't have any knowledge. We knew a little bit, just based off of, so Benjamin Delpy, the creator of Mimikatz, had talked a lot about smart cards and certificates. And I knew there was something there, like something to do with certificates and something to do with smart cards, but that was all my personal knowledge at the time. But since then, as we dove into this, we've definitely learned a lot more, and it's used in a lot more places. And so, like I said, the first thing that you have to do is kind of figure out how to obtain a certificate. And Will had mentioned you can send a request to the ADCS server called a CSR, a certificate signing request. And basically what you do is you say, hey, ADCS, I would like to request a certificate from a certain template. And a template is basically, it's a kind of a blueprint, and it defines the settings that are going to be in the resulting certificate that you're given. And so, for example, if you wanted a code signing certificate, inside of the template, it would state, anybody who obtains a certificate from this template, they're going to have code signing capabilities, basically. It also contains things like, how long is this certificate actually valid for, different kinds of encryption settings. But, that's what the most important thing there in the context of our research is some certificates you can request allow you to authenticate to Active Directory. So instead of code signing or instead of doing an SSL certificate, there's an extended key usage for client authentication or smart card logons to Active Directory. And so we can request a certificate, and in our request say, hey, we want to request a certificate from this template that allows for domain authentication. And then when we make that request, a CA, a certificate authority, it's going to look at that request, make sure it's valid, that template actually exists. There's also an access control model. So the CA is going to say, do you actually have permission to, request a certificate? And it'll check all that for you. And assuming everything goes okay, the CA, it has a private key, and it's going to sign a certificate for you, this special kind of file, and it's going to issue that certificate back. So, and basically that's going to identify you in the subject alternative name. So it's going to state, I'm Lee Christensen. And in the case of a client authentication certificate, my username is going to be in that subject alternative name field. So the CA is going to sign that and return it to me. And then I can use that certificate for whatever I want at that, to do what I need to do at that point. So I can use that certificate to authenticate to LDAP or authenticate to Kerberos underneath.
That's kind of the background, all crunched into 10 minutes for all this stuff. This took us, I don't know, months and months and hundreds of pages of, reading and experimenting, all the stuff to really kind of digest and grasp onto this. And I don't think either of us would have gotten the understanding we did if we had done it alone. It was nice to have it back and forth. And the stuff that resulted from this, of looking into this, and this is as a quick kind of side note for anyone that's ever interested in doing this type of research or these types of things. Lee and I always approach stuff of, we want to try to understand the system as deeply as we can. We don't go about saying, we want to try to figure out how to own Active Directory certificate service networks or something. We don't necessarily have that end goal in mind. We think we want to understand the system at a deeper level. And most of the time through that process, interesting security related implications kind of fall out of that as you start to understand this, complex holistic system at a deeper level. So the stuff that came out of this kind of at a high level that was interesting, it's not just domain escalation scenarios that I alluded to. There's elements of credential theft, machine persistence, numerous, specifically 8 different domain escalation misconfiguration scenarios, and a way to persist in the domain. So there's a lot of tradecraft that kind of came about from this. And I'll just touch on the credentials type stuff, Lee, and then I can throw it to you for the overview of the domain escalation stuff, if that's okay. But in general, for if you have an ADCS installation, a lot of people probably use this to get legitimate certificates. So if certificates are not protected by hardware, like a smart card or something called an HSM, which is like a hardware security module, or TPM for a trusted platform module. So if there's not a piece of hardware protecting the private key for a certificate, the private key is stored on your host, protected through keys associated with your user machine context, and through a system called DPAPI, which is an encryption system that's been a part of Windows for decades. And there are ways with Mimikatz and Sharp DPAPI that we talk about extensively in the white paper, where if you have code execution, you have something running in that user machine context, you can steal existing certificates that are on that host if they're not protected by hardware. So that's one of the things we kind of classify as passive credential theft. And on top of that, if there are these certificate templates that we mentioned that allow authentication, if those are present and we are allowed to enroll in them, then if we phish a user's context, for example, we could just enroll in that certificate actively and maliciously. And these certificates will last for a year or two or more. And it is separate credential material from a password. So even if someone's password changes, the certificate is still valid to authenticate to the domain. So what's interesting about this and putting it all together is it's a way to essentially steal a user's credentials and reuse their account for a year or more without having to touch LSAS and doing it in a way that's not as identifiable defensively, at least in the current state. And same with systems, you're able to enroll a machine itself in a certificate that then can be reused to compromise that host for up to a year or more. So that's kind of the first, and that's a really quick kind of overview of the tradecraft part of that. Again, the white paper goes into an extensive detail for how these things are actually executed. But that kind of passive and active, like credential theft and persisting on a system, was the first bit of tradecraft that we were able to come up with. Then the escalation stuff started to get a little more interesting.
Yeah, and
that's some serious persistence to be able to do something like that and have access for up to a couple years, and then the user doesn't know anything's going wrong unless you're doing something in their system or whatever. But that's pretty cool.
Oh, and it only gets worse. Believe me, there's some more stuff that's even scarier that we're going to talk about at the end.
Yeah. I just gonna add on to that too. Like, not just the user doesn't know. In our experience, most network defenders didn't even know. Like, as we've talked with security teams, they didn't realize this was a possibility in the first place at all. So we talk to people who respond to incidents, or like these internal teams who are responsible for if a computer gets compromised, they need to go like wipe the machine and then reset the user account password and stuff. Well, a big gap that we identified as we were doing this is that almost nobody is accounting for certificates. And so, like, even though they were wiping the machine and resetting passwords and stuff, like their incident response processes were completely missing out on this like piece of tradecraft. So an attacker still could have had access even after the defenders had like wiped machines and reset passwords and stuff. So it was a huge gap that I feel like we kind of highlighted and really want to emphasize to network defenders. Besides that, Will mentioned there are some domain escalation opportunities as well. So using Active Directory certificate services, so part of our research was identifying like current techniques that were known, but maybe not very well. And so there was one technique, one that we find very often, which we identify as escalation vector number 1 in our paper and our research. But what what it allows you to do is, I kind of talked about that enrollment process where I can say, hey, ADCS, I'd like to obtain a certificate. Well, in escalation number 1, there's a certain set of configurations that can happen that basically when I request a certificate, I can specify that subject alternative name field. I can say, hey, Active Directory or ADCS, I would like a certificate, but please put, Will's information in the subject alternative name, or put a domain admin's user in the subject alternative name. And then when ADCS sees that request, it's going to take basically what I put in there and just grant me a certificate as that user. So basically, this allows me to impersonate any user in the domain. I can obtain a certificate that would allow me to authenticate as any user in Active Directory or in the network. And so this is an extremely common misconfiguration that we've identified in networks. And like, we work with a lot of very large companies. And so we've identified it in these super large enterprise networks. And this definitely took us back of how common this is in environments.
Yeah, that's very, very important that you guys discovered that, because you could just imagine if a threat actor would have discovered that, what kind of havoc could be wreaked on enterprises.
And one of the things too, we mentioned this in the presentation, the paper, is a lot of these misconfigurations, including that one, were already known, well, technically known. There was information online about them, but most of the resources online would only cover one aspect or one specific type of misconfiguration. They wouldn't bring all of them together holistically. So while we found that particular one is fairly common, there are other misconfigurations that we found fairly frequently as well too. So the over 90% of organizations we've looked at have had one of the misconfigurations, the entire set, that results in the ability to escalate, to high privileges. But, again, while these things might have been public for a couple of years, the information was just a bit buried, or people just didn't seem to be familiar with it. So we were trying to kind of synthesize everything together. We added additional original research on top of it and wanted to kind of bring it to the public eye, because there are other escalation scenarios as well. Like if you're able to edit a template from an Active Directory control standpoint, there's a well-known flag that's kind of like a just make it work flag that you can set on CAs that results in you being able to specify these subject alternative names as well. There are these things called enrollment agent certificates and templates that can be misconfigured and abused. And there's a lot of these things that the system is complicated. And as we learned more and more about it, kind of working together, more and more of these things started to make sense. As we got that deeper view of the system, as everything started to click and started to understand. Most of those things were, again, like I mentioned, kind of known to some degree. There was one escalation vector, escalation 8, that we refer to in the paper, that Lee found that is a pretty big, like bad default type of thing. All the previous ones, 1 through 7, would require an administrator to accidentally misconfigure something, which was fairly easy with certificate services, to actually make a change one little bit without realizing what it did. But the escalation 8 that Lee found was definitely a little bit worse. I'll let him throw it to you for that.
Yeah, and that one has to do with there's different ways that you can perform enrollment. So enrollment is that process of requesting a certificate from ADCS. And there's an additional server role that you can install with ADCS that we often have seen enabled in environments that allows you to request a certificate using the HTTP protocol. So you can send just an HTTP request using like curl if you wanted to, and you'd be able to request a certificate. The problem is that this HTTP server uses NTLM authentication by default. And so there's a common, attack technique out there called pass the hash. It's probably one of the most prevalent, techniques in Windows networks over the years. And what it does is, using pass the hash, if somebody tries to authenticate to a machine that the attacker, have control over, I can basically impersonate that user. So let's say Will tries to connect to my machine. I can impersonate Will and then try and request a certificate from the ADCS server. Now, that's bad. This gets worse because there's techniques that you can use to coerce computer accounts in Active Directory to connect to you. So I released a tool around 3 years ago, called Spool Sample. And basically what that allows me to do is I can say, hey, domain controller, I'd like you to authenticate to me, the attacker. And then the domain controller is going to connect to me. And I'm going to use NTLM relay to impersonate the domain controller and then request a certificate from ADCS from that HTTP endpoint. And I'll be able to obtain a certificate as the domain controller. So now I can log on to Active Directory as a domain controller, which basically means I can obtain all the password hashes of all users in the network. And so that's like really bad. And this recently was in the news. If anybody had heard of the Petit Patam, the little hippo tool, underneath that performed a similar capability as like Spool Sample. It was the coerced authentication. It's coercing a machine to authenticate to you. But the root vulnerability there is that, or kind of the crux of it there is that they were able to relay it to Active Directory certificate services and abuse this HTTP endpoint to escalate privileges. So it's a pretty devastating default configuration when that server role is enabled. And we reported this to Microsoft, and funnily enough, Microsoft came back and they said, yeah, we agree with your assessment. Like, it is a problem, but it's not within our servicing criteria. So they're not going to fix it. So we disagree with them hugely on that. Like, we feel like it should be serviced, it should be fixed, but they've decided that they're not going to. So as an attacker, I think that's great. But
yeah. So that's kind of the stuff that made the news to a degree, because that really enabled that Petit Patam attack to actually be able to take over domains, because underneath the hood, it's abusing the Active Directory certificate services stuff. And then the last big kind of component, big area of tradecraft for the research was kind of a pipe dream that Lee and I had for a while, to where, people had talked about this stuff with like SolarWinds and Golden SAML, and golden tickets have been around for a long time. And there's this idea that these centralized systems like Kerberos or SAML authentication and all that, very often they end up reducing down to a handful of secrets in the whole, like everything's backed by, cryptographic secrets in the back end. So for example, golden tickets, if people aren't familiar, that's where if you steal the key that's used to create Kerberos tickets in an Active Directory domain, the KRB TGT hash, you can use that to forge your own ticket granting tickets with anything you want in it. With SAML, similarly, there's a key that you can use to forge all the SAML type authentication. And for Active Directory certificate services, there's the private key for a certificate authority that Lee had mentioned is used to sign these resulting certificates or return to people. So if you were able to steal the private key for a certificate authority, then in theory, you should be able to forge your own certificates as anybody. And there had been talk about this being possible for a while. There are some elements in Mimikatz from Benjamin Delpy's work that allow some of these things to kind of happen if you're on a certificate server or a certificate authority server. But we put together what we think might be the first proof of concept of tooling that allows you to steal non-hardware protected private keys from a certificate authority server, and then use that to forge certificates, ADCS certificates, as anybody, that will last as long as the certificate authority cert is valid. And these certificates can't be revoked. There's this normal process we didn't really touch on in certificate services or PKI in general, to where you could revoke issued certificates so they won't work anymore. But what's scary with this is, given just a couple of minutes, with code execution, an agent running on a certificate authority server, you can steal this key and then forge unrevocable certificates for like years, talking, 3, 4, 5, or even 10 years. So this is kind of golden certificates that we talk about in the white paper. And that's really this domain persistence type work that where Lee was able to build the proof of concept tooling for that we call Forge Cert that's now been released with Black Hat. So that's like kind of all that tradecraft of, the certificate theft and the active enrollment for stealing people's credentials and all that, and all the domain escalation scenarios. And then as well as this domain persistence component, the tradecraft really spanned like a huge amount of stuff for one topic area, which made it really interesting. And we felt like these things were bad enough that we actually delayed releasing the offensive tooling for a month and a half. We released a defensive tool set, the white paper, which also included about 45 pages of defensive guidance. So we tried to really do our homework and give people the resources to fix these things instead of just dropping tools and say, have fun. So it was an interesting process that we went through for this particular work, but we felt like all these issues are widespread enough and bad enough that we wanted to do our due diligence of giving everybody the resources they needed to try to audit and protect themselves first.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. All that came out of that research, from time to time, people hear certain exploits and maybe you can do one thing, but it's just amazing all the different attack vectors that you guys were able to come up with.
That definitely surprised us that we did not think that would be the result going in. Again, this all started with Lee saying like, hey, Will, look at the sentence in the Active Directory technical spec. This is kind of interesting, right? And then, 4 or 5 months later, we, resulted with this entirely like new area of tradecraft pretty much that we're able to use for assessments.
Very cool.
Yeah. I think that's kind of the general overview of a lot of this stuff. Some of the key points, I know that Leah touched on a few of these things, but this is expansive. All the stuff is huge, right? There's a lot of different tradecraft with it. A lot of these things are really just dangerous and bad, and people didn't realize the risk of these misconfigurations or the risk of these types of things because so many of us offensively and defensively just didn't have a great idea about the implications of these types of things. And I think it shows the payoff you can get from just spending time trying to understand these complex systems. Kind of from a security perspective, you'll usually find interesting things. And we really tried to do our best on the defensive side to give people like preventative guidance and detective guidance, because so many places, like Lee mentioned, don't have playbooks for how to handle these types of things. Like if you're compromised, do organizations know like what certificates this user has issued to them, or were issued from this computer, or were issued in this time frame, and those types of things? It's a much more difficult problem than you might think. So we've really tried to push the defensive side for places to develop incident response procedures and just general defensive administration procedures to handle this type of tradecraft.
Yeah, I like the way you guys do that, because some companies that perform pen tests will go out and give some generic remediation steps. So that's great that you guys put the research into showing how to remediate and fix and then respond to incidents.
Yeah, it's where we worked with some partners kind of privately with some of the guidance and things like that. That said, Lee and I are not Active Directory architects. We do not run these massive organizations and stuff like that. So as far as how effective some of these things will be or how easy some of these changes would be, we can't say 100%, but we did spend our time and did our best effort to try to research everything we thought could possibly apply for prevention and detection at a very specific level instead of having just that general guidance.
Yeah, and I think a big part of that is like trying to enable the defenders as well, like not just putting out guidance, but trying to create tools and stuff for defenders to use. Will and I definitely come from an extensive tool making background, definitely much more on the offensive side of things than defensively, but we really wanted to kind of enable defenders with this research to be able to check and identify these problems in their own network as well. So I think that was also kind of a fun part of this, was figuring out a way to enable them in a way that we haven't really we hadn't put that much effort into defensive tools before. So that was kind of fun along the way as well.
Oh, very cool.
Sure.
So anything else you guys would like to share?
I think that's a pretty good overview of everything. We know it's it's hard hard to kind of try to condense 140 pages into a half an hour podcast, but we definitely recommend people checking out the white paper, Certified Pre-Owned. It's on the SpectraOps research section on our website if people are interested. There's also open source tooling on our Ghost Pack, PACK on GitHub. This is the organization on GitHub. There's a project called PSPK Audit. As the defensive audit tool that we built. There is the project called Certify, which is a C# tool that enumerates and then also abuses these misconfigurations from an offensive perspective. And there's a tool called ForgeCert that does the certificate forgeries. And if people want to get started with playing around with this type of stuff, we always recommend, building an Active Directory lab. I know there are different, like 90-day trial license, like Windows images and things like that are around that you can use to build an Active Directory lab. Build it, install Active Directory certificate services, and then purposely do these misconfigurations and then practice actually, executing these types of attacks. As you start to do that, you'll see how these misconfigurations can come about from an administration standpoint. You can see how to audit and fix them defensively as well, how to abuse them offensively. So all this stuff is open source. All the information we release, we didn't keep anything back. There's no special sauce. So if people are interested in this, we thought it was pretty interesting to play around with. So we highly recommend you checking out the code or the white paper if you have any more questions. And we are also we're both on the Bloodhound Slack. I have Twitter DMs and stuff like that. And if people want to reach out and talk about this stuff, usually the best place to find us is the Bloodhound Slack channel.
Yeah. Just to kind of add on to what Will was saying about kind of how we went about researching this too. If I'd echo as well, like if you want to learn about this stuff, set up your own Active Directory lab and try and perform these actual steps. And that sounds a little intimidating, especially if you're kind of new to the industry. But when I was getting started in this, all I used was VirtualBox, and literally during most of this research, all I had was 2 VMs, a domain controller and a Windows machine. Like when we say Active Directory lab, we don't mean like an entire enterprise network. I'm literally talking 2 VMs. And going through and, manually setting that up in like the GUI, installing the domain controller, installing that server role, and then manually performing these, like the misconfigurations. I like doing that during my research of, figuring out how does an IT admin actually do these things through like the GUI, because it kind of helps you understand, okay, this is what they did to put it in this vulnerable state. And then we go about building tools so that we can enumerate that information during assessments that we're on for our company. So, I'd say for those getting into the industry who aren't maybe as familiar with this stuff, it's not as intimidating as you might think. You can set up these labs on using free tools out there, using the evaluation copies of Windows, and you'll get a lot of bang for your buck just out of learning how to do it yourself and practicing the tradecraft. So,
yeah, great information. Thanks for sharing your research and a couple of great takeaways. Your advice on building an Active Directory lab or building things, and Will's advice on really learning. I've got a friend of mine that I mentored and got started in pen testing. And one of the things that makes him so good is he reads the manuals. If he finds some new technology, he's pen testing, he goes out and reads the manual and understands it. Then he figures out how to get in. So
at the number of time, I don't know how many thousands of pages of Microsoft documentation that Lee and I have both read, over the years, as well as other documentation, to where, a lot of the stuff I've blogged about over the years has just been taking that really technical documentation and trying to translate it into playbooks essentially for my team, and then deciding to kind of translate that into blog posts to explain these concepts, to where I think it's very rewarding to me to try to understand that stuff at a deeper level, because again, security implications and things usually kind of fall out of that.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that research. Very, very interesting. And I want to dig into that white paper more now and see more information about that. I'd say I try to work now, but it could be AD direct connected Linux boxes, but my current pen test at work is all Linux. So to maybe be able to leverage that next time. But thanks for for taking the time to come on and explain your research. Big fan of you guys and the company and the work that you do. Thanks for all the stuff that you do and sharing. I mean, that's one of the things I like about you guys, that you're so open and sharing with your tools, and it's a big help to people in the community and the industry.
Yeah, I learned and kind of built my career on the shoulders of giants and learned from people that came before me, and people that had built tools and blogged about stuff and all that. So we just tried to kind of do our part of keep paying that good faith kind of forward. So, and thank you so much for having us on.
I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Glad to be here.
Thanks everyone for joining this episode, and we'll see you next time.
BugCrowd's award-winning platform combines actionable contextual intelligence with the skill and experience of the world's most elite hackers to help leading organizations identify and fix vulnerabilities, protect customers, and make the digitally connected world a safer place. Learn more at bugcrowd.com.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Hacker Factory podcast with Phillip Wylie. If you learned something new and this podcast made you think, then share itspmagazine.com with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to associate your brand with our conversations, sponsor one or more of our podcast channels. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. You can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society.